Tuesday of Holy Week. Jesus is back in the temple. The religious leaders, unable to ignore him, are attempting to shame, discredit, and quiet or prove that they are in charge. Jesus, though, stands his ground. The leaders are getting frustrated, embarrassed. They're ready to form their plan to bring him down. Their patience is wearing thin. After some back and forth with the Jewish leaders about whose authority Jesus is operating under, Jesus leans in with 3 parables, all pointed at the priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees, and they are anything but subtle. He brings the parables of the 2 sons, the tenants, and the wedding feast. They are each a sermon in themselves, and they all point to the religious leaders as unbelieving, treacherous, disobedient people and outside of God's kingdom. Jesus is exposing their hypocrisy and pronouncing judgment just as publicly as they questioned his authority. In Matthew 23, Jesus gives 36 verses blasting the Pharisees. He pronounces 7 woes with specific accusations about their character and condemnation. He does it in the temple, in front of the crowd, to their faces, and this embarrasses them. Jesus isn't playing anymore. He didn't come to align himself with the priests and Pharisees. There are no more hidden statements with subtle meanings. They've poked him enough for today, and the day is ending with everyone clear about where Jesus stands. The old way in life in the temple is over. The priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees were just put on notice. Their time is coming to an end. Later that night, Jesus leaves the town with his disciples, while some of the religious leaders gather in the city to plan his arrest, which would ultimately lead to his death. Jesus ascends the Mount of Olives. It overlooks the city of Jerusalem. And in Matthew 24, we see Jesus atop the mountain. Jesus is gazing at the temple and is fully aware of all that it represents for the Jews and their religious system. Jesus tells his disciples of its imminent destruction and demolition. The disciples approach Jesus with concern. They ask him for clues as to when and how these things will unfold. You can see that in Matthew 24, verse 3. Jesus warns them of false signs and then tells them of future events that will provide an end of the age. No doubt that was all very confusing and disturbing for the disciples. And so in the midst of all of that, Jesus offers his disciples and us critical assurance of the lasting and authoritative nature of his words. In Matthew 24, verse 35, on Tuesday, he says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Though everything we know of heaven and earth will one day be radically changed, Jesus declares that his words are unchanging and that they hold everlasting authority. This is no insignificant claim. With a statement such as this, Jesus declares himself equal with God. He is, after all, speaking of his own words in exactly the same way the Old Testament speaks of God's words. In Isaiah 40, verse 8, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever." And so what we know from that declaration is that as we look at the crucified and the risen Jesus this Easter, do not allow yourself to see him simply as a good teacher or merely an exemplary person. He is none other than God himself, creator of heaven and earth, who of his own authority took upon himself a shameful cross and rose triumphant from the grave in power, securing salvation for all who trust in him. Because his words will not pass away, as he declared on that Tuesday of Holy Week, you can trust him with your eternity. There really are two things that we must take from that. First, that if Jesus is God as he claims to be, then he deserves to be worshiped as God. So our awareness of his deity, as we reflect on that this week, should drive us to a worship of him as our God. And then second, we live on mission, sent with the authority of God when we obey the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. He said it in Matthew 28, all authority is in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. So as we worship this Easter season, and as you gather in your homes and with your family, remember that on Tuesday of Holy Week, we are reminded that Jesus is God.